There's a kind of man you don't meet in towns anymore. Not the loud ones, not the flashy, charming ones who know how to smile wide and shake hands firm, but the quiet ones. The ones who don't speak unless the moment asks for it. The kind who carry something old behind their eyes, like a memory they never managed to put down. Boone Laramie was that kind of man. He rode into Broken Mesa with a half-dead outlaw tied behind his saddle and dust on his coat thick from 6 days of desert riding. He wasn't in a hurry, even though he'd tracked that man across canyons and scrub until neither of them had much left to give. He didn't brag, didn't limp like he needed pity, just came in slow and steady, like a man who'd done worse and didn't care to explain. And maybe he had. See, Boone wasn't just a bounty hunter. He used to wear a badge. Sheriff Boone Laramie, back in the days before the name turned heavy in his mouth, before Agua Fria. People don't talk much about what happened there, but whatever it was, it made him quit. Left his badge buried deep in his coat pocket, where no one could see it, but he never quite let it go. That's how guilt works, doesn't it? We say we're done, but we keep it close, like a weight we think we deserve. So when the town sent word that they needed help, when a boy turned up gut-shot and bleeding, Boone didn't answer right away. Not until something in him stirred, some old duty that hadn't died yet. The outlaw wasn't just trouble. He was a ghost in the hills, stealing horses, killing ranchers, vanishing into the rocks like smoke. Boone tracked him without sleep that last night, waited until the man's fire burned low, and took him down with rope and pistol. He wasn't clean. The man fought wild, sick with fever and full of rage, but Boone didn't kill him. That was the deal. Alive. So he brought him back. And when he rode into Broken Mesa that morning, the councilmen were waiting. Pritchard, all smug mustache and soft hands, already had the smug little smile ready. Boone handed over the key to the outlaw's irons, didn't even look the man in the eye. "He's alive," he said. That was the condition. And Pritchard smiled wider, like he had a surprise. He said, "We've decided to offer you more than silver." Then the door opened, and out stepped 2 young women, barefoot, wrists bound in thick hemp rope, faces hard as stone. They were twins, Apache, taken off some trader's caravan near the border. No names, no family, no record. Just bodies, just property as far as the council saw it. "You might want something for the cabin," he said, like he was offering kindling or a spare boots. "Company, help, whatever suits you." There was a moment then, a long one, the kind that stretches thin across a man's bones. Boone didn't say anything. Just reached for the knife on his hip. And Pritchard, tensed, thought maybe this was going to get bloody, but Boone didn't draw it in anger. He stepped forward quiet and cut the rope off the first woman's wrists, then the second. The rope dropped between them like a dead thing, and without a word, he handed back the knife, turned his back on the council, and rode away. He didn't invite them, didn't ask them to follow, but they did. That part stays with me. You ever make a choice you don't plan to explain? One of those gut-deep decisions you don't even fully understand yourself, but you do it anyway because something in you knows it's the right thing, even if it costs you? That's what it felt like watching him ride away from that town, watching those 2 women, unbound, just stand there in the street, and then, after a minute, start walking after him. Not asking, not running, just following. And Boone, he didn't look back, because maybe part of him hoped they'd go their own way, and maybe part of him knew they wouldn't. What kind of life had they just been handed? To be traded like salt or bullets by men in vests and polished boots? What did it mean that Boone didn't accept the offer, not because he had to, but because he wouldn't? I think about that a lot. There's a difference between mercy and justice, between ownership and belonging, between saving someone and simply not taking part in their undoing. Boone didn't speak that difference out loud, but he lived it. He didn't bring the women home to save them. He didn't even bring them home, really. They came, they chose, and he left them. Sometimes healing doesn't begin with rescue. It begins with space. Quiet space where no one asks anything of you and no one explains who you're supposed to be. That's what Boone gave them. Not a future, not promises, just room. And for some people, that's more than enough. What happened next, that's another story. But it starts here on a hot morning in Broken Mesa, where a man who used to carry a badge cut a rope instead and rode home alone. Or at least he thought he did, until the sound of soft footsteps started up behind him, and somewhere out in that red dirt stretch, under a sky too wide to hold all the pain, something small and quiet began to shift. Not redemption, not yet, but maybe the start of it.
The thing about silence is, it tells you more than words ever could. When Boone Laramie rode out of Broken Mesa, leaving behind the outlaw and the council's cruel little gift, he didn't expect to be followed. He didn't invite company. He'd done what he thought was right, cut two strangers free, and turned his back on the whole damn scene. But a mile out, maybe two, he heard something. Not loud, not urgent, just the soft, steady rhythm of footsteps behind him. Not rushing, not calling his name, just following. And he didn't stop. He didn't ask why. He didn't have to. Because maybe he knew, deep down, that some people don't run when you give them the chance. They stay, not because they're grateful, not because they owe you, but because in a world where everyone wants something from you, silence can feel like the only safe offer. I think about that sometimes. How often do we mistake silence for distance, when really it's the beginning of trust? Boone didn't speak to the two women that first night. He didn't even look back when he reached his land, just led his horse into the crooked barn, unsaddled it in the dark, and stepped inside his cabin, alone, as always. But come morning, the plate of food he'd left on the porch was empty, and the women, Apache twins, still unnamed to him, were wrapped in old blankets, sitting quietly against the barn wall. They hadn't run, they hadn't knocked. They were just there. There's something about that kind of quiet. It humbles you. I remember once years ago when my father let a stranger stay the night in our tool shed after a storm. The man never asked for anything, not even water, just sat by the door all night, hands in his lap, like he was trying not to take up too much space in the world. I was a kid, but I remember my dad saying, "Some people just need somewhere to stop." That's what these women needed. Not rescue, not kindness, just stillness, a place where no one watched them like a problem to be solved. And Boone, he understood that. He didn't bring them inside, didn't ask their names. But the next morning, he left out 3 mugs of coffee instead of 1. And they took them, not with a smile, not with words, just quiet hands, measured movements, like animals skittish from too many traps, learning that this stretch of earth might not bite. It's strange how routines form without permission. Boone would leave food on the steps, they'd take it. Sometimes one of them, Nia, he later learned, would gather eggs before sunrise and leave them in a neat row on an old cloth. Aloe, her sister, mended his shirt without being asked, just folded it clean and left it on the porch rail, like it had always belonged there. They didn't knock on the door, and he didn't ask them in. But each day, something shifted, just slightly, like a rhythm forming between strangers who hadn't agreed to anything but kept showing up anyway. That's what this part of the story is really about, the space between people, how it fills slowly, not with words, but with gestures, with coffee cups, with folded cloth, with watching eyes and unspoken questions. And for Boone, that silence felt familiar. He wasn't a man built for soft things. He'd come back from a war, worn a badge too early, lost too many pieces of himself in places no one wanted to remember. Wadafria had taken something out of him, something he never said out loud. But these women, they didn't ask. And maybe that's why he didn't push them away. There's a line in an old novel I love. We don't speak of it because speaking gives it shape. But the shape already exists. It just waits for someone not to flinch. That's what this was. Not friendship, not family, not yet, but nobody flinched. And in a world that had been nothing but damage and taking, that meant something. One morning, Boone found Nia sitting by the chicken coop, feeding a lame hen by hand. Her fingers were careful, her face calm, like she'd done this kind of thing before. Aloe was by the fence line, hammering at a loose post with rope she must have found in the barn. They didn't speak to him, didn't ask permission, but they acted like they belonged. And he let them. Because here's the truth no one likes to say out loud. Sometimes belonging isn't granted, it's claimed. Quietly, day by day, with no ceremony, no handshake, no title. Just action. And in the stillness between that cabin and the barn, 3 people began to orbit one another, not out of need, not out of duty, but because none of them had anywhere else to be. You ever find yourself in a place like that? Not perfect, not planned, but right somehow. Like your bones understand before your mind catches up. That's where Boone found himself. And for 2 women who had been passed from hand to hand like something to be owned, maybe this land, the quiet well, the crooked barn, and the man who never asked for anything, was the first place that didn't demand a price. That's not something you walk away from easily. So they stayed, and Boone didn't stop them. He didn't know if it was mercy, or habit, or something deeper. He just knew that when he stepped out in the morning now, the porch had 3 mugs instead of 1. The chickens were calmer, the tools were where they were supposed to be, and the land didn't feel as empty. He didn't ask for this. But then again, maybe that's why it mattered. Because healing rarely arrives the way we expect. Sometimes it walks up behind you, barefoot and silent, and waits for you to leave the door unlocked.
They didn't talk about staying. Not once, but they never left. Some mornings, you don't realize something's changed until you wake up and find the world just a little quieter, a little more in rhythm. That's how it was with Boone and the 2 women. No one said, "We live here now." No one shook hands or laid out rules. But each morning, the lines between you and me blurred just enough to make room for we, and it began with small things. The first time, Boone had stepped out with his coffee, half expecting to see an empty barn. Instead, he found Nia crouched near the coop, gently coaxing a hen into her lap, her fingers moving soft as breath over its wing. She didn't flinch when she saw him, didn't explain, just kept working like it was the most natural thing in the world. The next day, his shirt, torn at the shoulder from the bounty chase, was folded and mended, left on the porch rail, threaded with hands that had done it 1,000 times before. He never asked, and they never waited for thanks. There's a kind of respect in that quiet, unspoken labor. Not submission, not obligation, but something older, something that says, this is worth tending, even if no one notices. I've always believed you can measure a home not by what's said, but by what's done when no one's watching. And the women, they did. Aloe took to the fence line, tightening rope, brushing the old mule down in the evening. Nia left neat rows of eggs on a worn cloth by the pump. Sometimes she swept the barn floor clean with an old broom Boone thought he'd tossed out. No one kept score, no one gave orders. The work just happened, like breath, like habit, like healing. And then the fever came. It hit Nia in the middle of the second week, slow at first, just a shiver in the night. Then by dawn she was burning, her breath shallow and quick. Boone didn't wait. He brought water, willow tincture, clean rags, whatever was left from his army days. Aloe never left her side, didn't speak, didn't weep, just sat still, changing cloth after cloth with hands that had seen too much, too soon.
There's a kind of fear that doesn't scream, doesn't panic. It just sits in your chest like a weight, and Boone knew it well. He didn't sleep that night, just sat in the barn's far corner, boots off, rifle leaning against the wall. He changed rags when Alo's hands trembled, fed Nia small spoonfuls of water when she could take it. The rain tapped soft against the roof above, but inside it was silent. You ever watch someone fight a fever without saying a word? It's strange how still the world gets, like time itself holds its breath. By morning, the worst had passed. Nia's skin cooled, her chest rose slower, and Alo, still straight-backed, still alert, finally closed her eyes for the first time in days. Boone didn't say anything. He just stood in the doorway, looking out at the light pushing through the clouds. Everything was damp. Everything smelled of straw and wet wood. But for the first time in a long while, something held. Something fragile, but real. And that's when he knew. They weren't just passing through anymore. They hadn't said it. They didn't need to. The barn, the porch, the mule, the fire, they belonged to all of them now. Not by ownership, but by presence, by effort, by choice. There's a scene I remember from an old film. Maybe you've seen it. A man builds a table for two, then finds himself setting 3 places without realizing it, not because he's told to, but because the world quietly asked him to make room. That's what happened here. Each day after that, Boone started doing more, not out of charity, but out of rhythm. He sharpened an extra knife, left it where Alo could find it, made enough stew for 3, left the door cracked longer in the evening. And each day, the women answered in kind. Alo repaired the hinge on the barn door, tied off the quilt that had come undone at the corner. Nia began humming again, soft melodies Boone didn't recognize but didn't want to interrupt. They never asked for more, but they never offered less, and that's what made it sacred. We're always told that families are formed by blood or marriage or some grand declaration, but I've come to believe families often begin in smaller ways, in a gesture, a glance, a shared pot of coffee, the simple act of showing up when no one expects it. You don't need a reason to stay. You just need the courage to stop running, and the people who let you. One morning, Boone found himself setting out 3 mugs without thinking. Another day, Nia brushed the old dog's coat until it stopped growling when she passed. Alo left a piece of jerky by his saddle before he rode to check the fence. No thank yous, no conversations, just presence. I think that's what makes this part of the story matter most. Not the fever, not the mended shirt, but the fact that no one kept a tally. No one named the roles they were growing into. They just became. Caretaker, neighbor, guard, guest, friend, family, whatever you want to call it. And Boone, who had once built his cabin to be a place of hiding, was beginning to see it for what it really was. A place where 3 people, all carrying different kinds of silence, could start learning how to breathe again. Not loudly, not easily, but together. And sometimes, that's more than enough. You ever wake up one day and realize you've been sharing your life with someone without even meaning to? That's how it was with Boone, Alo, and Nia. Not that anyone said it out loud. They didn't sit at the table one morning and declare, "We're a household now." No one wrote down rules, no contracts, no labels. But somehow, slowly, gently, they began building something together. It started with a fence post. One of the rails near the stream had split from dry rot. Boone had been meaning to fix it for months, but the chore just kept slipping. Too much heat, too much memory, too much quiet. But one morning when the haze hadn't quite lifted off the field, he spotted Alo near the fence line, rope in her hand, trying to patch it herself. He didn't stop her. Instead, he walked over and set a mug of coffee on the nearest post. She didn't thank him, didn't flinch, didn't retreat. just gave a small nod, said okay when he suggested replacing the rail. It was the first word she'd spoken to him directly, and for Boone, that word, okay, meant more than any story ever could. Because trust, it doesn't arrive in thunderclaps. It shows up quiet. It lets you come close. I think a lot about how hard it is in this life to let people near you after you've been hurt. Really hurt. Not scraped or bruised, but gutted. Like something sacred inside you got torn out. If you've ever been through that kind of pain, you know what I mean. So when Aloe started mending things around the place, tightening hinges, sweeping the barn, pulling weeds by the side of the cabin, Boone didn't take it for granted. He didn't comment, didn't assign her chores. He just noticed. And sometimes that's the most generous thing we can do for another person. To notice without owning. To witness without naming. Later that same week, they started working the land together. Spring had been long gone, but the soil still held some stubborn moisture near the back ridge. Aloe brought out a sack of root cuttings. God knows where she'd found them. And without a word, she started digging with the heel of her boot. Boone joined her. They didn't speak, didn't plan, but the rows began to form all the same. Side by side, they worked. Sometimes that's all you need to know if a thing will hold, whether two people can labor beside one another in the heat and the dust without tripping over each other's shadows. And at night, they ate. The meals were simple. Stew, beans, hard bread, but they were shared. No more plates left on the porch, no more waiting. Aloe and Nia started stepping inside when the food was ready. They took their places without invitation. Boone didn't gesture, didn't say, "Come in," but he'd leave the door open. And sometimes, that's the invitation. There's a kind of rhythm that grows from shared labor. A pulse that beats slower than words, slower than feelings even, but it's steady. And once it's there, it's hard to unfeel. I remember once, I was living in a shared cabin out in Colorado for a couple weeks, helping an old friend with a broken roof. We barely spoke the whole time. Just worked, ate, rested. But I still think about those quiet evenings when he'd hand me a coffee without looking, and I knew exactly what that meant. Some bonds don't need narration. And in the silence between Boone and Aloe, something had begun to stir. They didn't flirt, didn't circle each other like lovers in waiting. That wasn't the shape of this, at least not yet. What they shared first was ease. No more guarded glances, no more waiting for the other to flinch. When Aloe caught him watching her patch the quilt, she didn't look away. She held his gaze, just for a second, but that second held everything. And Boone, he never once asked about their past, never said, "What happened before the town gave you to me?" He could have, but he didn't. Because some wounds don't need to be spoken to be understood. And Boone, he'd seen enough of the world to know that not all pain needs a name. It's easy to assume that trust comes from the asking. Tell me who you are, where you've been, what was done to you. But sometimes it comes from the not asking, from letting someone keep their own story intact, folded up neat, untouched by your curiosity. That's what Boone gave them. And in return, they stayed. And more than that, they began to lean in. Not loudly, not quickly, but steadily. There was the afternoon Aloe brought him his mended coat, clean, pressed, the torn lining stitched tighter than he would have done himself. She didn't say, "I fixed this for you," just handed it over, stood there, measuring his face. He nodded. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. Then there was Nia. Boone found her near the coop again, hand-feeding one of the younger hens. Her shoulders had softened since the fever. Her step still slow but steady. When he asked, "You feeling better?" she didn't hesitate, just nodded, said yes, then added after a pause, "My grandfather raised chickens." Not a full story, not a confession, but a doorway. A flicker of memory shared. And Boone? He didn't push it open, just stood beside her a while. Sometimes that's how trust grows, not in grand gestures, but in side-by-side stillness. And slowly, the cabin began to shift. It no longer felt like Boone's place alone. The porch had a second mug waiting before he asked. The saddle blanket was folded differently, neater. The oil lamp stayed lit longer in the evenings. Little things, quiet things, but meaningful. Because now when Aloe walked through the door, she didn't pause like a guest. And when Nia stirred the pot on the stove, she hummed like she'd always been there. And Boone, he didn't feel the urge to leave. Not anymore. Funny how the smallest shifts can reroute a man's whole life. No grand declarations, no blood oaths, just a fence fixed, a meal shared, a coat mended, and a silence that finally felt safe. By the time summer began to set in heavy across the land, the three of them had become something solid. Not perfect, not simple, but rooted. And for a man who'd once sworn off connection, who'd built a life out of solitude and silence, that was nothing short of a miracle.
There's a certain kind of heat that settles into your bones before noon, the kind that makes even the wind feel mean. That's how it was the morning they went back into town. 3 of them. Boone led the mule, reins in one hand, revolver riding high on his hip like it still meant something. Aloe walked beside him, shoulders squared, quiet but not small. And Naya rode up on the mule, one hand steadying the pack behind her, the other shielding her eyes from the glare. They didn't talk much on the ride in. There wasn't anything to say. But the silence wasn't tense. It was practiced, like a tune they'd played a dozen times before. Boone's boots kicked dust into the air with each step, and by the time they crested the ridge and the rooftops of Broken Mesa came into view, that old weight, the one he thought he'd buried years ago, started pressing down on him again. There's something about returning to a place that once tried to break you. Doesn't matter how long it's been, doesn't matter how far you've come, the land remembers, the people remember, and sometimes they don't need to say a word for you to feel it. They passed the general store, the saloon, the old bank still boarded up from last year's flood. Heads turned, conversations paused mid-sentence. Men leaned back in chairs, squinting from behind dusty brims. No one called out, no one greeted them. But they noticed. It wasn't just the fact that Boone had come back, it was who he brought with him. And they remembered. They remembered the day he rode in with a bloodied outlaw and refused the town's reward. They remembered how he cut the ropes and walked away with 2 women no one had claimed. And now, weeks later, there they were, walking in beside him like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. I wonder, have you ever had to walk into a room knowing people have already made up their minds about you? There's a kind of courage in that. Not the loud, chest-thumping kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that looks straight ahead and keeps walking anyway. Inside the general store, the air was thick with grain dust and the faint scent of oiled tools. A teenage boy stood behind the counter, eyes wide and twitchy, clearly new. The old clerk must have moved on. Boone stepped forward, voice calm, measured. "We'll need dried beans, flour, salt, hard tack. 3 yards of wool, brown or gray. Boots, size 5 and 6. The boy stammered something close to, "Yes, sir," and then scurried off through the back curtain. Boone didn't move. Aloe wandered toward the fabric bolts, brushing her fingers along the edge of a thick roll of wool. Naya crouched near the bottom shelf, inspecting canning jars like she'd done it her whole life. No one said anything, and still the space felt full of presence, of awareness of choices made and no longer hidden. You know that feeling when you realize you're not just surviving anymore? You're living? Claiming space? Not loud, but real. That's what it looked like in that store. They paid with what coin Boone had left, traded a sack of herbs and 3 clean rabbit pelts for the rest. The boy didn't ask questions, just bagged the goods and kept his eyes low. But Boone saw movement outside the window. Councilman Pritchard,
Same stiff mustache, same 2 clean boots, standing with his arms crossed like the past few weeks hadn't happened. When they stepped outside, Pritchard didn't wait. "You're making a statement, Sheriff," he said, voice flat and too smooth. Boone didn't blink. "I'm buying supplies." He smirked. "They still under your roof?" That's when something shifted. A pause, heavy as thunder in the chest. Boone's jaw tightened. Then, voice low, steady, without room for misunderstanding, "They live with me. They work. They're free. That's all there is to it." And in that moment, I swear that town held its breath. Allo stepped forward, not behind him, but beside. That one small move said everything. Pritchard noticed. His eyes flicked to her, then away. Cowardly, predictable. "Just make sure your arrangements stay civil," Pritchard muttered, tipping his hat in a gesture that meant less than nothing. And just like that, he turned and walked off. No threats, no demands, but the message had landed. Not just for Pritchard, for everyone watching. When they left town, no one followed, but the eyes stayed on them until the rooftops disappeared behind the ridge again. Back at the cabin, the air felt different, warmer somehow, more settled. Naya unpacked the dry goods without a word, lining the jars neatly on the shelf like she'd done it her whole life. Allo laid the folded wool across the bed, fingers lingering on the fabric's grain. Boone sat on the porch, hat tilted low, a rifle across his knees, not in fear, but in habit. He didn't like being reminded that people still looked at those 2 women like property, like questions that needed answering. And most of all, he hated being reminded that sometimes all it takes is silence for cruelty to survive. But Allo came out quietly, sat across from him on the rail. The breeze kicked up dust. No one spoke for a long while. Then she asked, "You worried what they'll say?" He shook his head. "No." "You looked like you were." Boone leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "I'm not worried about talk. I'm worried about someone might believe it gives him permission." She nodded once. "We can handle ourselves." "I know, but I still keep watch." And then, after another pause, softer this time, she added, "We're not leaving." He turned to her. "We weren't sure at first, but we've decided we stay." And Boone, who had lived most of his adult life bracing for goodbye, just let the words sit. Then he nodded, once. Simple. Final. All right. There was no music, no fanfare. Just the hum of wind through brittle grass and the long shadow of a mule near the barn. But in that moment, a decision had been made. They weren't running anymore. They weren't just surviving. They were choosing, and choosing each other. And sometimes, that's all a family really is.
You don't always feel the moment something changes. Sometimes it's just the sound of a chair pulling out, the smell of stew on the stove, a second plate set on the table, then a third. That's how it began, with a door left open longer than usual and no one asking why. One evening, the light was falling soft over the fields, casting long shadows across the porch. Boone had laid out 3 plates, like he'd done the past few days. The cabin was warm from the wood stove, quiet except for the faint hum of crickets starting up in the brush. He ate slow, waiting, not expecting much. And then, without fanfare, Allo stepped in. Her dress was clean, her hair was braided different, tighter, pulled back like she meant it to stay that way. Naya followed close behind, arms folded over her middle, her eyes scanning the room like she hadn't seen it from the inside before. They didn't ask permission. They just walked in and took their seats. It wasn't a celebration. No one toasted. No one said, "This is home now." But something settled in that room like dust finding its place on an old shelf.
something steady, familiar. They passed the bread, poured the coffee. Naya asked for seconds. Aloe didn't, but when the meal was done, she stood and started clearing plates without a word. Boone moved to stip her out of instinct. "You don't have to," he said, quiet. She looked him straight in the eye and said, just as quiet, "I want to." You ever notice how the most important things people say are often the simplest? That line, it stuck with him. Not because it was dramatic, but because it wasn't. Because it came from a place that wasn't guarded anymore. That night, the kitchen didn't feel like his. It felt like theirs. And that scared him a little, if he was honest. Not because he didn't want it, but because he hadn't planned for any of it. That next morning, the boots he usually left kicked off by the door were lined up neat. The table had been wiped down. One of the shutters that always clacked loose in the wind. Aloe had tied it shut with a strip of cloth. Nothing dramatic, just intention. You ever live alone so long that the smallest kindness feels like thunder in your chest? That was Boone, standing there with his coffee, not quite knowing what to do with the stillness. Later that week, something shifted again, this time in words. Naya was sitting on the porch steps as dusk rolled in, her hands curled around a cup of water. Boone stepped out, nodding at her without saying much. That had always been the rhythm. Soft nods, few words. But this time, she spoke. "I remember what it felt like, being owned," she said. Her voice wasn't shaky, just quiet, certain. "I didn't say anything before because I wasn't ready. But I want you to know, when they gave us to you, I expected you to take us, like they wanted." Boone didn't speak right away. His jaw tensed. His hands, still holding the edge of the railing, went still. Then he said with the weight of someone who meant every word, "I didn't take anything." Naya looked at him, met his eyes. "I know. That's why we stayed." And just like that, the truth that had sat between them for weeks, like a ghost no one dared name, finally had air to breathe. That conversation opened something in Boone, not because it revealed what had happened to him. He'd always suspected more than he asked, but because it revealed something about him, too. That he could be trusted, even by someone who'd been betrayed by every hand that ever reached toward her. Trust like that doesn't come easy, doesn't come fast. It's built brick by brick, in silence, in stillness, in actions so small most folks never notice them. But Aloe noticed. Later that same night, she came and sat beside him by the hearth. The fire crackled low. Shadows danced up the cabin walls. She didn't say much, didn't need to, but after a few minutes, she looked over at him and said, "We can't go back." She meant their old life, the place before, the people who never came to find him. There's no land left, no family. It's gone. Boone nodded once, not as pity, not as comfort, just recognition. "I don't have to tell me, not unless you want to. I'm telling you because we've made a choice. You need to know it's not out of need." Boone glanced toward her, brows low. "Then why?" he asked. She met his eyes, calm and clear. "Because this place feels like something we've never had, not even before they took us. And you never tried to explain us to yourself. You didn't ask for anything. You just let us be." Let us be. There's something beautiful about that phrase, isn't it? To let someone be, not fix them, not save them, not mold them into what makes you comfortable. Just be. That night, as the fire dimmed and the wind picked up outside, Aloe stood, walked over to where Boone sat, stopped just inches away. "I'm not offering because I owe you. I'm offering because I want to." She knelt. Boone raised his hand,
gently touched her cheek, and when their lips met, it wasn't hungry or desperate or uncertain. It was steady. It was choice. And when she leaned against him, breath soft at his chest, neither of them said a word. They didn't need to, because in that quiet, two people, who'd once been strangers lost in separate ruins, had finally found something worth building, not out of guilt, not out of rescue, but out of recognition. You were safe here. You belong. And for Boone Laramie, who'd once come to that cabin to hide from the world, that might have been the loudest truth he'd ever heard.
Some mornings you wake up before the light. Not from noise, not from dreams, just a quiet pull somewhere in your chest. That kind of stillness, it usually means something's coming. That's how it was for Boone that morning. The cabin was still wrapped in dark, save for the faint glow of the stove. Outside, frost curled along the window glass, and the air carried that soft ache of early spring, where winter hasn't fully let go, but the land is beginning to stir again. Inside, Boone sat at the table, coffee mug cupped in both hands, steam curling around the edge of his coat. He didn't know what he was waiting for, but something had shifted in the past few weeks, quietly, steadily. It started the day Nia leaned against the kitchen counter and let out a slow breath. Aloe stood beside her, silent, just watching. Then she turned to Boone and said it, plain as anything. She's with child. She didn't say it softly, didn't dress it up in worry or shame, just stated it like it was fact, like it was time he knew. Boone didn't blink, didn't look away. He turned toward Nia and asked, simply, "How long?" "A few months," Aloe answered. Then gently, "It happened before we met you." The sentence didn't need to be finished. Boone heard everything inside the pause. He didn't ask who. Didn't want to. He set his mug down slow and steady, looked from one woman to the other, and said the only thing that mattered. "Do either of you need anything?" And that, right there, is the kind of man Boone Laramie was. Not one for long speeches, not one to bury people in pity or pretend to understand what he hadn't lived, but a man who, when life dropped something heavy in front of him, didn't flinch. He just picked it up and carried it the best he could. From that moment on, the rhythm of the place changed. Aloe took over most of the care. She talked more now, mostly with Nia, but sometimes with Boone too. Her voice had lost that sharp edge it used to carry, that flinch wrapped in control. It had softened, not weak, but steady. Nia slowed down. Her steps were more careful. She spent her mornings near the cabin, folding linens or humming while stirring oats at the stove. She didn't say much about what was coming, but her hands had begun to linger longer on her belly. Her eyes, once tired, now held something different, something watchful, waiting. Boone noticed everything. He sealed the windows tighter, doubled the firewood pile, hauled water more often, not because anyone told him to, just because that's what you do when someone's counting on you, even if they don't ask. And then one night, as the fire burned low and the coyotes called in the distance, it happened. The baby came. It was just before dawn. The light hadn't broken the sky yet. Boone sat outside, rifle across his lap, not because there was danger, but because that's where he belonged right then, keeping watch, staying close, but not in the way. He heard the cries. First Nia's, sharp and breathless, then Aloe's calm voice, giving instructions, then silence, then the cry of something brand new, something alive. He didn't go in right away, just let the sound settle over him like a blanket, like a promise he hadn't realized he'd made. When Aloe stepped out, her breath visible in the cold, she said, "She's all right, so's the baby." Boone just nodded, slow, grounded. "Boy or girl?" he asked. "Girl. Small, strong." She didn't say more. She didn't need to. Inside, Nia was pale but calm. The baby, wrapped in one of Aloe's cloths, slept against her chest, mouth open in the softest way. And then came the moment Boone hadn't planned for. Nia looked up and asked, "You want to hold her?" Her voice wasn't hesitant, it was sure. And something about the way she asked, like she already knew he would, knocked the air clean out of his chest. He nodded, held out his arms, and for the first time, cradled a life that wasn't his by blood, but felt like it had always belonged in his hands. The baby was heavier than he expected, warm, real. She clenched the edge of the blanket with one tiny fist, like she was anchoring herself to the world. And Boone didn't smile, didn't speak, just held her. Let that moment soak into every scar, every silence he'd carried all these years. I don't know if you've ever held a child that wasn't your own, but still felt like they chose you. I have. And I can tell you, there is no clearer invitation into the world than that. Over the next few weeks, everything changed, but not loudly. Nia got stronger. Boone helped her walk each day, never too far, never rushed. Aloe planted root vegetables with a kind of quiet determination, like she already knew this place was theirs to tend now. And the baby, whom Nia had named Wren, whispered one night when the fire burned low, slept most of the day, swaddled close to whoever carried her. Sometimes it was Nia, sometimes Aloe, and sometimes it was Boone. Always, without ceremony, always like it had been that way forever. And here's the thing no one talks about when it comes to family. Sometimes it's not about blood, not about history, not even about promises. Sometimes it's just about showing up every day, in every small, unspectacular way. Feeding the chickens, fetching water, replacing the latch on the door, holding the child that wasn't yours, but is. And when Boone looked at Wren, tiny fist curled at her cheek, her breath soft and steady against his shirt, he didn't see someone else's past. He saw his own future. And for the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was just passing through it. He felt like he belonged in it.
There's a moment, somewhere between survival and belonging, where things finally stop feeling temporary. And for Boone Laramie, that moment came on a quiet morning in late autumn. The air was cold enough to bite, but not cruel. The kind of morning that smells like wood smoke and damp soil. The garden had given up most of its harvest, the firewood was stacked high along the wall, and inside the cabin the soft sounds of new life echoed. Baby Wren fussing against her mother's chest, Anaya's voice low and steady, Aloe humming as she rinsed a pot. It wasn't loud, it wasn't perfect, but it worked. The rhythm of their home had settled into something real, something sturdy. You ever live with people long enough that the silence between you becomes a kind of language? That's what they had now. Boone would wake before dawn, check the traps, haul water. Anaya fed the baby, sang songs Boone had never heard before, gentle, full of words in a tongue he didn't understand but didn't need to. Aloe kept the hearth running, organized the pantry, tended the little greens still hanging on in the garden beds. They didn't assign roles, they just did what needed doing. No questions, no orders, just shared purpose. And Boone, the man who once came to this place to be alone, now found himself missing the sound of soft footsteps behind him when someone wasn't home. Funny how that happens. I remember once, years ago, spending time on a small ranch with a couple who'd adopted 2 children, both from different pasts, different griefs, and it struck me how quiet love can be when it's honest. How much healing comes not from grand gestures, but from choosing each other again and again and again every day. That's what was happening here. It was more than sharing space. It was choosing to build something inside it. And then, one day, Boone knew it was time. He pulled on his coat, adjusted the rifle strap over his shoulder, and saddled the mule. Aloe met him at the barn, arms crossed, eyes steady. "You sure?" she asked. He nodded. It's time they stop whispering and start listening. She didn't argue, just handed him a sack of dried meat and water for the ride. The trip into Broken Mesa was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles around you when you know what you're about to do matters, but you're done being afraid of it. When Boone stepped off the mule, boots hitting the dust with a slow, heavy certainty, folks noticed. They always did. The man had a presence like a worn stone, shaped by time, not effort. He walked straight to the council hall. Pritchard was there, of course. Same cold eyes, same two neat papers on the table like they made him more than a man. Boone didn't sit, didn't wait to be asked. He stood tall, calloused hands resting easy at his sides. And then he spoke. They live with me. They've got their own land, their own fire, and if they want it, they've got my name too. No one said a word. Boone let the silence sit, let it stretch out like a warning. I'm not asking for permission, just making it plain. Councilman Pritchard cleared his throat, adjusted a pen that didn't need adjusting. They aren't your blood, he said carefully. No, they're not. There's something more. There was a weight to that room that couldn't be shaken loose, a clarity that didn't come from law or title or tradition, but from truth. Boone didn't demand recognition. He was recognition, living proof that some bonds are stronger than blood. And in the end, the council didn't argue. They didn't offer a blessing either. But Boone didn't ride back for approval. He rode back for home. When he reached the ridge above the cabin, the sun had begun its slow descent. The light stretched long over the land, brushing gold across the edges of the roof, the fence, the line of garden now asleep for winter. Wren was outside, bundled against Allow's chest. She looked up when she heard the mule, a gurgle of sound bubbling from her lips. Boone dismounted slow, walked to them without a word. Allow handed the child over like she had 100 times before, but this time, something was different. Boone took Wren in his arms and held her high for a moment. Let the cool wind hit her cheeks, let her see the sky above her, the land below, the house behind her. Then he brought her close, rested her against his shoulder, and whispered, like a prayer not meant for God, but for the ground itself, "You're home, little one." It wasn't about being her father, not by title, not by blood. It was about standing still long enough to be someone she could count on. It was about claiming her as his in the only way that mattered, by showing up every day without fail. And in that moment, with the wind curling around them and the fire inside crackling to life, Boone felt something he hadn't in years. Peace. Not the kind you chase with drink or silence or distance, but the kind you build with soil, with hands, with trust. A home, a family, a name freely given not because it was needed, but because it was offered. And that's the thing, isn't it? In a world that often tells us love has to be earned, that family must come with papers or permission, Boone Laramie and the people under his roof found something simpler, stronger. They found each other.
There's a sound that only comes at the end of a long journey. It's not triumphant, not loud. It's the hush of a door being closed for the last time, not because someone is leaving, but because everyone's finally home. And that's where we find them now. Not running, not waiting for the next knock at the door, just there, fully, freely, settled. Out at the cabin, the days have grown shorter but not darker. The baby, little Wren, has learned how to sit up on her own. Her laughter fills the rooms like morning sun through thin curtains. Nia keeps herbs drying by the stove. Allow's taken to carving, small shapes, animals, feathers.
quiet work, done by hands that once only knew survival. And Boone still wakes before anyone else. He steps outside just before the frost lifts, when the world is quiet enough to hear itself breathe. From the porch, he watches the light creep across the soil. There's a fence now, a simple one, but strong. A line between the world and what they've built. Not to keep others out, but to mark that this, right here, is theirs. Do you know what it means to stop preparing for goodbye? To live each day without checking for the exit? Without rehearsing your escape? That's what they found. But it didn't come from a promise. There were no contracts, no handshakes or vows exchanged under moonlight. What they built came from something rarer, something harder. Choice. Not the kind made in desperation, but the kind you return to day after day. People stayed because they wanted to. Because the air tasted better here. Because the ground didn't ask who they'd once been, it only cared how they walked upon it now. Aloe, who once barely spoke a word, now reads out loud by firelight. Not for anyone in particular, just because the cabin feels full enough to hold her voice. Nia, whose hands once trembled every time someone reached for her, now reaches first, lifting her daughter, brushing hair behind Aloe's ear, handing Boone a fresh-baked roll while muttering, "You don't eat, you fade." And Boone, that man who once carried guilt like a second skin, who built solitude like a fortress, now watches over them, not from fear, but from gratitude. He's still not loud, still doesn't waste words, but something in his posture has shifted. He no longer leans back like someone bracing for impact. He leans forward, like a man planting roots. There's a moment I think about often. I wasn't there, of course, but I imagine it this way. One afternoon, Boone steps out into the yard. The sky is wide and blue, stretched to the edges like canvas. A breeze stirs the laundry on the line. Chickens cluck quietly in the coop. The baby's laughter rings from inside. And he just stops. Hands on his hips, breathing deep, looking out over everything they've made. Fence posts, garden rows, a smoke trail rising from the chimney like a slow exhale. And he realizes, without ceremony, without announcement, that this is it. The place where his past no longer owns him, where shame has no voice, where no one owes anyone anything. Just 3 people, 4 now with Ren, choosing each other. You ever feel that way? Like maybe the life you've built didn't follow the map, but somehow it still got you exactly where you needed to be? I think that's what healing really looks like. Not a clean slate, not forgetting the fire that once burned you, but learning to hold warmth again without flinching. And here's the truth. Nothing they had was guaranteed, but nothing needed to be. Because once you've fought to build something from pieces, broken pieces, painful pieces, what you make isn't fragile. It's earned. Boone didn't rescue anyone, and they didn't save him. They just stayed long enough to see each other clearly. And when the world outside kept asking for definitions, what are you to them? What claim do you have? Boone finally answered in the only way that mattered. This is my home. These are my people. And if they want it, they have my name. Not because they were his, but because he belonged to them just the same. And that's what sticks with me most about this story. It's not about outlaws or town councils or redemption in the classic sense. It's about 3 people and a child who stopped surviving and started living together by choice, by trust, by a kind of love that doesn't need explaining. The kind of love that looks like cooking breakfast, like sitting in silence, like staying, even when the door is open,
In the final image I want you to hold, Boone is standing by that fence. The sun's dipping low, the soil smells warm, turned from the garden beds. Smoke rises steady from the chimney, curling soft into the sky. Inside, there's laughter, there's crying, there's the clutter and hum of ordinary life, and Boone just stands there for a while, watching. No longer waiting to be left, no longer wondering if it's real, just breathing in the truth of it, that somehow, through grief and guilt and the long, long road of silence, he got a second chance. And this time, he didn't waste it.